The leader of one of the nations engaged in World War I hypothesized that, quote, with the defeat of the Reich and pending the emergence of the Asiatic, the African, and perhaps the South American nationalisms, there will remain in the world two great powers capable of confronting each other, the United States and Soviet Russia. The laws of both history and geography will compel these two powers to a trial of strength, either militarily or in the fields of economics and ideology. That leader was Adolf Hitler, and the year was 1945. We know what happens next. Welcome to Operation History, in our first video of our Losing the Peace series. This video is about the United States and the Soviet Union and what happened based on the peace created from World War II. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, two countries that sought to avoid becoming involved in World War II, would shape the next 50 years of world history. Much like the Treaty of Versailles, contained within the origins of the Second World War, the peace to end World War II contained within the beginnings of the Cold War. Add in the peculiarity of the personalities involved, and you get history. The mistrust between the Soviet Union on one side and the United States and the United Kingdom on the other became evident that they were allies fighting against Hitler's Germany. That mistrust actually goes back to the end of the First World War, when Britain and the United States forces fought with the, quote, White Army against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. It took 16 years until November 1933 for the United States, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to recognize the Soviet Union. For their part, the United States and the United Kingdom were painfully aware that the Soviet Union had signed the non-aggression treaty with Hitler in 1939, thereby enabling Hitler to undertake his conquest of Europe without a threat from an Eastern Front. During the war, the United States and the United Kingdom resisted the Soviet request to quickly open a second front in Europe, and did not share the details regarding the timing of the landing in France. The United States did not inform the Soviets about their capability to drop an atomic bomb as well. So in discussing the beginnings of the Cold War, we have to consider the relationships between the big three: Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt. Stalin is quoted as saying in June 1944 that, quote, Churchill is the kind of man who will pick your pocket of a kopeck if you do not watch him. Roosevelt is not like that. He only dips his hand in for bigger coins. Stalin may not have believed Lenin's prediction that the communist revolutions would arise spontaneously in other industrialized countries. Rather, Stalin's foreign policy viewed the Soviet Union itself as the center from which socialism would spread and eventually defeat capitalism. Essentially, it was the exporting of Russia's communist revolution by force. Stalin once said that the, quote, idea of propagating the world communist revolution was an ideological screen to hide our desire for world domination. In talking about the Cold War, Stalin observed, this war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. It cannot be otherwise. Roosevelt was more accommodating than Churchill in the expanding Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, and also the Far East. Roosevelt saw the possibility of the great powers exerting their influence to keep a post-war peace, and did not want to keep the United States troops in Europe for more than a year or two after the war. Roosevelt sought the use of the United States power after World War II to build a peace based on the Wilsonian principles of self-determination, open markets, and collective security. Roosevelt thought there was a possibility of mutual evolution, the socialization of American capitalism and the liberalization of Soviet socialism that would allow the two systems to coexist. Remember, Roosevelt was the president of the New Deal, and Roosevelt had called for the adoption of an economic Bill of Rights. Churchill was closer to and more focused on the post-war makeup of Europe, because Britain went to war over Poland in 1939. However, Churchill's commitment to self-determination ultimately faltered in favor of his desire to maintain the British influence over Greece and the Mediterranean. Churchill said, quote, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. The Mediterranean was the supply line to Britain's Asian Empire." That very much explains Churchill's emphasis on attacking the Axis in North Africa and Italy. After the significant devastation of Russia in World War I, the Russian Civil War as a result of Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, Stalin was concerned about providing a buffer between the Soviet Union and the European powers. Soon after the attack by Germany, Stalin actually demanded a post-war settlement that would retain the benefits of the non-aggression pact with Hitler, control over the Baltic states, Finland, Romania, and Poland. Stalin raised the issue of the post-war borders with Churchill and Roosevelt repeatedly in 1941 and 1942. Not receiving a satisfactory response, Stalin changed track in 1942, deciding to let the post-war borders be decided by the correlation of forces. That is, the borders would ultimately be decided by where the Red Army had its boots on the ground. The joint declaration by the President and the Prime Minister was issued by Churchill and Roosevelt on August 14, 1941, and that document became known as the Atlantic Charter and explained the war aims of the Allies. That was 4 months before the United States declared war on Germany or Japan. Of the 8 points of the Charter, 3 were designed to guide the post-war borders. 1. No territorial gains by the victors. 2. Territorial adjustments in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. And 3. All peoples had a right to self-determination. The principles of the Atlantic Charter were adopted in September 1941 by the governments in exile of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia, as well as the Soviet Union. In this case, these lofty principles were seemingly made to be compromised. The first abandonment of the Atlantic Charter principles began in 1943 at the Tehran Conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Stalin and Churchill set the borders of Poland to be the Kurzon line in the east and the Oder-Neisse line in the west, thus shifting some land from Poland to the Soviet Union and some land from Germany to Poland. FDR did not participate in these discussions, and the redrawing of the borders was not ratified until the Potsdam Conference several years later. Although Stalin agreed to a vote in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia before these Baltic republics were absorbed into the Soviet Union, but without lack of international supervision, it would have been apparent that those elections would be anything but fair. Churchill and Stalin met in Moscow on October 9, 1944, for what was called the Tulski Conference, based on the code name given to the meeting. Churchill reiterated the importance of Greece to Britain to Stalin and indicated that Romania was a, quote, Russian affair. Churchill seemingly acknowledged the petulant nature of his statement, quipped, "It is better to express these things in diplomatic terms and to not use the phrase dividing into spheres, because Americans might be shocked." Turning to the Balkans, Churchill then produced what he subsequently called a, quote, naughty document, showing a list of the Balkan countries with a percentage of interest of each country by the great powers. Romania was a 90% Soviet, Bulgaria was 75% Soviet, Greece was a 90% British, while Yugoslavia and Hungary were split 50-50. Stalin looked at the document, put a large blue check mark, and handed it back to Churchill. Churchill commented, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if we seem to have disposed of such issues, such fateful to millions of people, in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper." Stalin advised otherwise. The meaning and importance of the percentages agreement is open to debate. However, it is unclear what the percentages actually meant. They could have been percentages of territory or the proportion of seats in the governing councils. Foreign ministers Eden and Molotov were not even sure what the percentages meant, despite spending much time negotiating the final percentages. Churchill said the percentages were, quote, intended to express the interest and sentiment with which the British and Soviet governments approached these problems of these countries. Nonetheless, that, quote, naughty document demonstrated Churchill's willingness to appease Stalin's need for secure borders in return for British control of the Mediterranean. The Yalta Conference was held in February 1945. By the time of the Yalta Conference, Soviet forces controlled much of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and large swaths of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. At Yalta, Roosevelt was concerned about the Soviets joining the war against Japan, becoming a part of the United Nations. Churchill was concerned about blocking Russian demands for massive reparations from Germany and securing a role for France in the occupation of Germany. Those concerns led to compromises with Stalin. Ultimately, Stalin promised free elections for Poland. Churchill believed Stalin would keep his word, observing, quote, "Poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin," end quote. He was. On March 21st, 1945, Averell Harriman, the ambassador to the Soviet Union, cabled Roosevelt that, quote, "We must come clearly to realize that the Soviet program is the establishment of totalitarianism, ending personal liberty and democracy as we know it." 2 days later, Roosevelt acknowledged that, quote, "Averell is right." In regard to the principles of the Atlantic Charter, the Soviets stated that the, quote, "practical application of these principles will necessarily adapt itself to the circumstances, needs, and historic peculiarities of particular countries." Throughout the negotiations regarding post-war Europe, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov warned Stalin that the American insistence on free elections in Eastern Europe was, quote, "going too far." Stalin replied, "Don't worry, we'll work it out. We can deal with it in our own way later. The point is correlation of forces." On May 18, 1945, Churchill instructed his chiefs of staff to develop a contingency military plan to, quote, "get a square deal for Poland." The operation was named Operation Unthinkable, based on both the idea that it was unthinkable to go to war with a former ally, and on the conclusion that, although Britain might be successful in Poland, that would lead to another war in which Britain would have a chance of losing. The unthinkable never happened. On March 5th, 1946, former British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill visited Westminster College and confirmed the inevitable result of the peace ending the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all of the capitals of the ancient cities of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the population around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and are all the subject in one form or another, not only to the Soviet influence, but to a very high, and in many cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow.